What are some psychology experiments with interesting results? White rats and black rats were raised separately without seeing each other. When a black rat was placed in the white rat's cage, the other rats ostracized him. When white and black rats are raised together and a new black rat is placed in a cage, the white rats accept him. So basically rats are racist. Unless raised to accept differences. Not entirely sure it fits into the category, but the Rosenhan Experiment. 13 people feigned mental illnesses to get into mental hospitals and all were admitted with different diagnoses. They then assumed their normal personalities, but to be released they all had to admit that they were mentally ill. There was a second part where a hospital challenged Rosenhan to send multiple fake patients to the hospital and they would rate their patients on a scale of whether they think they were faking. They identified many possible fakers, but Rosenhan in fact hadn't sent anyone. I'm a huge fan of Milgram's Small World Experiment. It is more sociology than psychology, but I still think it is really cool. Milgram sends out 160 letters containing the name and address of a stockbroker in Boston to people in Omaha, Nebraska. They had to send it to someone they thought would get the letter closer, but they couldn't mail it directly to the stockbroker. Interestingly, most people that sent on the letter sent it on to the same group of people on the 5th degree. It only took 6 people, hence the 6 degrees of separation, to arrive. On average, it shows how interconnected our world is, even before the internet, which is happy to think about. The 3 Christs of Ypsilanti. Psychologist forces 3 people who believe that they are Jesus Christ to live together. It does not go well. The psychologist, Milton Rokeach, had heard of a case where 2 women who believed that they were Mary, Mother of Christ, were forced to live together and one of them broke free from their delusion. So he figured, 3 Christs, what would happen? They were angry at each other, often had physical fights. They eventually started getting along by avoiding the topic. He would ask them about the others and each would say that the others were crazy. That they, of course, were the real Jesus. No cures. Some unethical stuff. Interesting though. The Monopoly study by Paul Piff. He basically brought 2 strangers into the lab together and had them play a game of Monopoly together. He randomly assigned one participant to start the game with twice as much money than the other, and that participant also got to roll both dice to get around the board. i.e., the other participant started with half the money and could only roll 1 dice. At the end of the game, when he asked the participants who started with more money why he won the game, they would chalk it up to their excellent strategy and gamesmanship rather than the fact that they had started the game with way more resources. It says a lot about how we deal with being born into a privileged state. Reconsolidation. When you retrieve a memory from your long-term memory, it is susceptible to being manipulated. This can lead to memories being totally changed from the source. This is why eyewitness accounts cannot be fully seen as true. This knowledge is also being used to help people with PTSD by changing the negative memories they have of their particular trauma. Mice were put on 2 sides of a wall with a door in. Only the right mouse could open the door. Slowly, they filled the left mouse's room with water, and eventually when right mouse saw them in danger, they opened the door. However, mice that had previously been on the left side and were now on the right, mice who had previously been wetted, opened the door considerably faster because they knew how unpleasant it was to be in the other scenario. Basically, mice have empathy. Link here. BBC. Com. Earth. Story. 20,150,514 rats save mates from drowning. It's not that psychopaths lack empathy, but rather, they have the manual settings. A specific region of the brain lights up when people experience empathy. For most people it's an automatic, subconscious response. But in a study where they showed emotional videos to psychopaths and non while scanning their brains, psychopaths would only light that region of the brain when specifically asked to feel for the character, while the control participants would light up automatically. The car crash experiment. It demonstrated that the way investigators word a question has an immediate effect on the subject's memory of an event. It was part of a suite of studies by Elizabeth Loftus, with various other co-researchers, that began to call in to question the veracity of eyewitness accounts. Simply Psychology. Org. Loftus Palmer. HTML. One time I participated in a paid research experiment. I was basically tricked into thinking I was drunk. I was placed in a room with 2 other people and we were instructed to drink vodka with cranberry juice over a period of time while we socialized. After we drank, I was placed in a room where I had to read some flashing words on a computer. I felt pretty drunk at this point. When the researcher came back into the room, he gave me my car keys and said I was never actually given alcohol. He briefly told me that because I was anticipating drinking for this experiment that my brain had tricked me into feeling the effects of being intoxicated. I immediately snapped out of it and was completely amazed at how I felt. Aaron and Dutton. 1974. Misattribution of arousal. Men who had just walked across bridge, either steady or unsteady, were approached by a female psychology student, posing to do a project on the effects of exposure to scenic attractions on creative expression. The men had to complete a questionnaire and write a short dramatic story about a picture she provided, and she gave them her phone number if they had more questions. Men who walked across the shaky bridge were more likely to call her up because they misattributed the arousal from the bridge to the woman. TLDR. Watch a horror movie on the first date. Edit. Grammar. Sorry about the confusion. The phantom limb experiment is pretty fascinating. Basically, you can be tricked into feeling something that's not there. Here's an article about the experiment. Edit. Grammar. Not just one experiment, but a whole thesis and series of works supporting it. According to the just world fallacy, we expect good or bad things to happen to people for a reason and go to pretty interesting length to make up for the lack of justice. Like someone winning the lottery and us thinking they deserve it. Not a psychologist, but the one where given a choice between sitting down doing nothing and shocking oneself, people tend to choose the shock. Ergo, we would choose pain over boredom. I don't know the name of it, but apparently two people become closer if they survive through something together. Not even actual surviving death scenarios, but anything that has you on your toes and heart racing, like a roller coaster. Wegner and his white bears. Essentially, people who were instructed to not think about a white bear found themselves thinking about it more than those actively trying to think about one. N.M. Wikipedia. Org. Wiki. Ironic process theory. Dunning-Kruger effect is one of my favorites. Basically, people with less expertise in a field will overestimate their abilities in the given field because they don't know enough to see the limits of their expertise. At the same time, experts tend to underestimate their abilities because they know too well what they don't know. The phenomenon has, among other factors, been linked to anti-vaxxers, who overestimate their expertise, not seeing what they don't know, with dire consequences. There was an experiment to measure the dopamine, i.e. happiness, hit your brain takes when eating something you're craving. The dopamine builds with the anticipation and peaks right as you take the first bite. Then, after the first moment it's in your mouth, the dopamine levels begin to decrease. This showed that many times we are desiring. Edited to show the distinction made by poster below. Asterisk the attainment of the thing more than the thing itself. Edit. Not to proselytize, but this corresponds somewhat to the Buddhist principle of unsatisfactory desire. It's very interesting. The Rosenthal Effect. The prejudice and expectations you have towards a student, contestant, etc. highly dictates his performance in the long run. Look it up, aka Pygmalion effect. If people have the upper hand, they will put others down to keep it. An experiment told a class of kids that having blue eyes meant you were smarter, achieved more, etc. All of a sudden kids with blue eyes formed their own groups. Things like bullying and exclusion of other eye colors started too. They repeated the experiment with different eye colors in different classes, all with the same results. Split brain studies. One example. By providing differing information to each hemisphere of the brain in split brain individuals, those with a severed corpus callosum, meaning there's no communication between the two hemispheres, they found that people would actually physically grab their own hand with their other hand if they saw it making a mistake. Basically, each side of the brain controls one side of your body. And in split brain people you can actually make both sides display a disagreement with the other, which is insane, if you think about it. Well, the salmon study. To test a behavioral procedure in an MRI machine, the experimenters got a dead salmon to use as a dummy, as it had to be something organic. They were in shock when they discovered that the fMRI was recording increased bold response, blood oxygen level dependent, in the dead salmon when running their experiment, suggesting this dead salmon's brain was somehow reacting to the experiment. This led to the findings that fMRI is not perfect and we should expect a certain level of false positives, highlighting the importance of retests and tighter statistical analyses. Not quite psychology, but it very cool. Normally, if you try to mix blue light with yellow light, red and green, it turns out as white light. A scientist conducted an experiment where they would shine blue light in one eye of someone and yellow light in the other. The majority said that they just saw the light separately, but some said that they saw a new color that they couldn't even describe. This also works with cyan and red, and magenta and green. Hubel and Wiesel inserted an electrode into the brain of a cat and took a single-cell recording of a cell in its visual cortex. By somewhat of an accident, they found that the neuron only fired when an object had one specific orientation. This was pretty much the discovery of center, surround on, off visual processing cells in the V1 visual cortex. Cool stuff. Not so much a Psychology experiment, but a finding by retail researchers that if a woman is touched below the waist within the first 10 minutes of entering a store, she will leave immediately. That's why retailers who are onto this finding space their displays wide apart at the front of the store, to minimize bumping. Then they pack the merchandise tight in the back, because shoppers who've made their way back there have already been in the store 10 minutes. Wish I had a link for this. It was cited in a magazine article a decade ago. The case study done of Jeannie. She was a severely neglected child that never learned to speak. It became apparent that it is not possible to learn a first language as an adolescent. Edit. Op. If you're in high school, you might enjoy taking a P psychology. Hedonic adaptation. Put simply, a person who had just won the lottery and another person who had just been paralyzed took a survey to measure their life contentment. Obviously it was high and low, respectively. However, they both took the same survey a year later and both scored similarly. The point being that regardless what happens to you in life, good or bad, you will always adapt and spend most of your life feeling neutral. The rule tends to be the less ethical the experiment is, the more interesting. The Little Albert experiment. A psychologist conditioned a baby into being scared of white, fluffy things. I also like this one very much. Scientists replicated 100 recent psychology experiments. More than half of them failed. Our psych class repeated an experiment where half the class held a pencil in between their teeth, and the other half balanced on their top lips. We then rated how funny we thought a comic strip was. Turns out using face muscles associated with smiling, pencil between teeth, made the comic strip subjectively funnier than those associated with frowning, pencil balanced on top lips. Choosing to smile or frown can change how you feel and perceive life. We make snap decisions 7 seconds before we think we do. The decision is made by other parts of your brain leaving your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain you use to think, to rationalize the decision, so you don't decide anything based on rational thought. You just try to explain your decision after it has been made. MPG. Research, unconscious decisions in the brain. The elevator groupthink study. Very amusing and sad at the same time. The experiment involved several actors entering an elevator with an oblivious participant. They then begin to perform a series of odd behaviors, such as they all stood facing the rear of the elevator. Inevitably, everyone else who got on ended up also facing the rear so as not to stand out from the rest. The study demonstrates how easily people succumb to group pressure to behave in a certain way. A bunch of chimpanzees got trained that they get coins which they could redeem for snacks. Very quickly the guys did spend their coins on the female chimpanzees to frock them and the girls bought snacks for it. Quite insane. Edit. Capuchin monkeys. Some science. Research. How scientists taught monkeys the concept of money not long after the first prostitute monkey appeared. Saw an experiment where people were subject to boredom. Empty room with absolutely nothing to do, except for a small device that releases painful electric shock when pressed. People would bear a few minutes of boredom, but then they start shocking themselves because they would rather feel pain than intense boredom. Subjects were tested for introvert versus extrovert personality types. Prediction was that when placed in a sensory deprivation chamber the introverts would be able to handle it easily while the extroverts would not. Exactly the reverse was found. Introverts became agitated quickly and performed all manners of self-stimulation. Extroverts quickly went to sleep. What the finding showed was that it's introverts who are the sensation seekers, needing stimulation from the outside world. Extroverts create their own internal sensation and project that out to the world. Wikipedia. Org. Wiki. Rat Park. Alexander's hypothesis was that drugs do not cause addiction, and that the apparent addiction to opiate drugs commonly observed in laboratory rats exposed to them is attributable to their living conditions, and not to any addictive property of the drug itself. 1. To test his hypothesis, Alexander built Rat Park, a large housing colony, 200 times the floor area of a standard laboratory cage. There were 16-20 rats of both sexes in residence, food, balls and wheels for play, and enough space for mating. 2. The results of the experiment appeared to support his hypothesis. Just the general psychological phenomenon of loss aversion. In cognitive psychology and decision theory, loss aversion refers to people's tendency to prefer avoiding losses to acquiring equivalent gains. It is better to not lose $5 than to find $5. It's basically why insurance companies exist. Hurricanes with female names are deadlier than those with male names. A paper published in PNAS by Jung et al. 2014 used 6 decades of death rates from U.S. hurricanes and lab experiments and found that feminine-named hurricanes cause significantly more deaths than do masculine-named hurricanes. This is because hurricane names lead to gender-based expectations about intensity and severity, which in turn guides people's intentions to take protective action. A stunning finding on the effects of gender stereotypes. A lot of good material for that regard in thinking. Fast and slow. Recent small sample size experiment in toddlers. 18 Mo. I think. Investigating the link between fine plus gross motor skills and time spent on a computer tablet. Results showed no difference in gross motor skills between children who had spent lots of time on a tablet, and children who had spent no time at all on one. Fine motor skills and understanding the task was largely increased in those who had spent time on tablets. There's been a couple interesting studies on mice, rat utopias and overcrowding. I think the one I linked actually inspired the Rats of NIMH book. The Pratfall effect. In essence, if you are considered highly competent, you become more likable after a small mistake. The classic example, and what happened in the initial experiment, involved people spilling coffee during an interview to be a contestant on a show. If someone demonstrated themselves to be intelligent and competent, they became more likable after spilling coffee on themselves. Anyone previously seen as average or less than ideal actually suffered from the blunder. Henry Murray conducted experiments on Harvard students where he had them write an essay about personal beliefs and aspirations. They would then shame them by repeatedly using this information. On one particular student they noticed he had an acute response to a point that it traumatized him for life. This student was Ted Kaczynski, aka the Unabomber. He sent his bombs primarily focused at faculty from different institutions. I am fascinated by the psychology of the placebo effect. ELI 5 for clarity. A person is given a benign substance with no known health benefits but are told that it will treat, cure, etc. their condition. And it does. While this is often observed in drug tests where half of the test subjects receive a new drug, and half receive a sugar pill, there has been some research that Dr. Andrew Weil cites that shows the placebo effect can be capitalized on and used to help people heal. Essentially, your brain can do what many drugs do if you believe that it can. I read something a few weeks ago that wasn't a psychology experiment per se, but the results were interesting. In Israel, they introduced a fine that they would hit you with if you picked your kid up from daycare late. They thought that they could get more people to pick their kids up on time. The opposite actually happened. More people started picking up kids late because they were okay with taking a fine, rather than being put in a socially embarrassing predicament where they would have to apologize to the daycare lady. Just goes to show that you never really know what the results will be, even if you think you've thought of everything. The Robbers Cave experiment. Basically, they took 24 boys into the woods and split them up into groups of 12. Each group was told to make a flag and a name. They were put through team-building exercises, and went through the predicted storming, norming, conforming phases. When put in competition with the others, rivalries grew, which were demonstrated when the boys were forced to eat together, and not segregate themselves. Later on, the researchers cut off the water supply to the camp and forced the two tribes to work together to fix it. They ended up going through the same storming, norming, conforming process and put aside their rivalries, eventually becoming one homogeneous tribe, even going as far as all talking as one group on the bus home. We tried to do one as a continuation to an existing experiment having to do with how the jury outcome changes in a rape trial when you present neutral information about the defendant. The previous experiment presented that information and the guilty verdicts decreased. Neutral as in personal facts about the male without the intent to make him look superior. Example, favorite color. Food. The university turned down our proposal because it was a sensitive topic, but the original study is out there. The Bobo Dolls experiment revealed the impact of modeling violence on children's behaviors. MK Ultra is barbaric yet very interesting. You'd be amazed at some of the survivor testimonies. The levels of programming and abuse put the human psyche in places we can't imagine. While short-lived, chewing gum before a test can help you perform better. Gum. Never test without it. Source. Don't know if you guys would care for it, but there are tons of experiments concerning babies and how they perceive the world. One interesting one that stuck with me was when one research team found out that babies recognize consonants of almost every language known to man. But as they grow up, they lose this ability. This supports Chomsky's concept of a language center in our brains, but there are tons of other researches disapproving it too.